In this quick start tutorial, we're going to explore 3D Coat's Render Workspace. You may have already noticed that you have PBR rendering in the viewport, so you get a close approximation of what the final render result is going to look like, even as you're working here inside the viewport. But for an added level of realism, you would want to go to the Render Workspace and either click Render to render a single image, or Render Animation, and you have the option to turn real-time render on, so that you can make adjustments as it's rendering. For example, you could change the shader, but what I have here is a standard 3D Coat PBR shader applied to a high poly sculpt. Paint objects, on the other hand, do not have shaders, so you would typically just texture paint or apply smart materials to them. However, a sculpt object is rather unique in that regard. You can apply a PBR shader that you see here, but you can also texture paint or apply smart materials over the top of them. I wanted to draw that distinction because if you are working on a sculpt object, then you can apply a skin shader. Right now, this is just a default PBR shader, but you can scroll down and use the default skin shader. It's in alphabetical order. Let me scroll down just a little bit more, and yeah, here it is. Skin shader. I can select the layer I want to apply it to from the Voxtria layer panel. So when I click on that, now you'll see quite a difference. As you let it render, it becomes more and more of a subtle effect. You can change that by right-clicking and choosing either Edit Permanent Shader Settings, which I would not recommend for the default shader. You can construct a new shader off of that, and that's what I have here. I have a few different variants. So I'm going to choose this one. It's much more subtle. Again, I can right-click and choose Edit Current Object Shader Settings so that I'm only modifying it at this point in time. Let's adjust our settings here. You can choose your subsurface scattering degree. The subsurface color is the big difference here. The default skin shader is bright red, where here it's more of a peach color. So let's change that to a brighter red. We can also adjust our HDRI map here. I can rotate it. I'm going to adjust the blurring by clicking and dragging left on that icon. If you drag to the right, it's going to increase the blurring. If you drag it to the left, it's going to decrease it. I can see my light source here a bit better. So it's facing more toward the sun here. Let's go back the other direction. If I want to add an additional light to the scene, I can do that here. I can rotate the angle. Sometimes it's better to turn real-time rendering off while you make this adjustment. It's a little bit easier to see this way. So yeah, if I wanted a little bit more light toward the front, then I could use this additional light. I can adjust the intensity here. I can change the color. I can click Find the Sun. It tries to find your light source, the brightest spot on your HDRI map, and when you click Find Sun, it places your light in that location. So let's go back. There we go. And let's turn real-time rendering on. All right. Let's uncheck that. We have some options for our panorama environment or HDRI map. And then we can adjust the exposure here and also the contribution of your environment light. Go back to 100. Quite a difference. So let's go 0.2. I'll uncheck real-time render. And let's give it a color. Let's kind of a green. Let it render for just a bit. Okay, so let me uncheck that. We can go ahead and delete our light. Go back to real-time render. Let's rotate our HDRI map. If we want to create a turntable rendering of our model, we simply need to check the render frame sequence here and set the number of frames, which is 360 by default. So it's going to be a complete circle around the object. But if you have camera shortcuts created, which you can create them here, add a camera shortcut or control up arrow, 3D Coat will go between the different camera shortcuts that you've created. So let's say if your camera shortcut 1 is here, and if I zoom in just past the head and hit Control up or click here, it's going to create another camera shortcut. Now if I check move around shortcuts, when I render a sequence out, it's going to render between those two shortcuts. Another thing you can do is you can have a retypo mesh wireframe visible over the top, so you can click show retypo mesh. This one doesn't have one created yet, but again, that's an option available to you. Store alpha channel is going to leave the background transparent. If you uncheck that, the model and the background will be rendered together. Also, if you want to make a successive attempt to render, you can have 3D Coat make sure it doesn't overwrite the sequence or the individual frame you just created previously. You have a close spline option, raise per frame. If I want it to continue cooking and try to refine the render even more, I would add more raise. Again, it's GPU accelerated or graphic card accelerated, so it will go through it fairly quickly depending on the capabilities of your graphic card. You can see the result up here. Because it's so bright, you can't really see the numbers too well, but if you had a darker background, you would. Okay, so it's done. If you want to store your single image or your sequence, you would click here, point to where you want it to be located, name it. Let's try, this one. Save. And then let's go ahead and render. Okay, so I'll click here and we can see that it did render it. All right. So as far as depth of field, you can check depth of field plane and adjust its position here. And then uncheck depth of field plane, real-time render. Let me choose the eyelids and that same shader. So yeah, even though you have texture painting on a given layer, you can still see the subsurface scattering beneath it. So let me choose this other one. That's going to affect just the eyelids. Yep. Let me uncheck that for the moment. And let's go to Edit Current Object Shader Settings. So this is not going to affect the permanent shader. Let's make that 0.5 so it's not so strong. I can hit OK. Now let's go back to real-time render. One last thing I want to point out. Let's turn real-time render off. There's an option in the viewport to turn shadows on. It gives you a little bit more realism here in the viewport. You get a very close approximation of the final render result. You can see subsurface scattering right here in the viewport. You don't have to step into the render workspace to see it, although it looks best in that environment. But again, with that checked, you can see some of the subsurface scattering occurring here in the viewport. And with that, we will conclude this look at using 3D Coat's hardware render inside the render workspace. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the RenderMan integration that has been added in 4.8. So thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.